Hello, America. Welcome back to Honest Tax Returns. This is part 6 of 6 presented to the American people in December 2016. This part is called The Terms of Entrapment. So, do you earn wages? Are you an employee? Are you a U.S. person? Do you have earned income? Do you own a trade or business? Are you an officer of a corporation? Are you a self-employed individual? These are questions that the IRS would like you to answer, and based on your answer, they establish contract. Now let us study how federal terms are designed to convert ordinary people and their money into federal property, which then becomes subject to the federal income tax. The terms of entrapment are legally called the terms of art, or term of art. They include things like employee, employer, wages, service, earned income, trade or business, and gross income, and so forth. Now, as we have learned, title controls subject, so all custom IRC terms are prima facie limited to internal, domestic, United States, District of Columbia, or federal subjects. That means unless specified otherwise, they are presumed to be limited to those terms or to that subject matter on its face, prima facie. So federal income from a federal payer is lawfully reported by one of these federal information returns. Now, the federal information returns contain words, again, such as wages, person, service, employer, employee, and so forth. And these words are ordinary dictionary words. However, the Internal Revenue Code has actually turned these words and made them their own. They have made them customized. So they have a custom definition for each of these words. Now, if you use their custom definition, guess what you've just done? You've just taken ordinary wages, an ordinary employee and employer, and relegated that subject into the federal income subject matter, or the subject matter of federal income. So basically, you're claiming federal income on your own behalf, even though you've never gotten any. Okay, so that's how it basically works. So let's give the short version of how it works. An employee is one who works for the government, including an officer of a corporation. An employer is one who hires an employee. Wages are payments from an employer to an employee, and a corporation is a domestic corporation, as are all persons. So right there, you can see that if you have wages, it's by definition given to you by an employer. And that word employer is defined by the word employee. And so if you go to the word employee and you read that, it's like you work for the government. So obviously you're in some sort of employment by an employer, and whatever you receive, called wages, are federal income. And of course, domestic corporations means domestic with respect to the District of Columbia and not to the 50 states. When the Internal Revenue Code calls you a self-employed individual, it means one with earned income. And one with earned income means one with gross income derived from a trade or business, and a trade or business equals the functions of a public office. So if you use any of those terms, self-employment, earned income, trade or business, or gross income, guess what you've just done? You've just called your own money federal property, and now you're subject to the federal income tax. Okay, a service recipient is one for whom service is performed. And a person is defined as a government unit, agency, or instrumentality. So if you get a contract, like on a 1099, and you supposedly served somebody, then that person is called a service recipient. And if you agree with that, then looking down further into the code, you'll realize that that one person is actually a government unit, agency, or instrumentality. So in other words, if you perform a service, you're working for the government. And if you have a service recipient, well, they are the government and they are your boss. Okay, that's how that's how tricky it is. Okay, so the following IRC discussion may be excruciatingly boring for some viewers, but you might need this for intellectual, informational, or legal purposes. And if you interact at all with the IRS, then you definitely need to know their language. Now, go back to part 1 to see how these terms of art are applied to real-life examples of honest tax returns by honest people in order to minimize their federal income tax or even eliminate it altogether. The law means what it says. So if you think we're just playing around with words, well, then why don't you read this from the Supreme Court? It says, when a statute includes an explicit definition, we must follow that definition, even if it varies from that term's ordinary meaning. So in other words, terms like wages, they don't mean what what Main Street thinks it means. Wages is a very specific, defined term. And chances are, if you don't work for the government, you ain't got no wages. Okay? There you go. So let's start with the word employee because it's the most complicated one. And the employee is defined at several places. Section 401, 3121, 3401, and 7701. So which employee are you? Let's start with section 401. Now remember, when you look at a section number, for instance 401, you can't just read what it says for the definition. You have to give it context. And how do you give it context? So you got to work backwards to see what subchapter it is in, what part it is in, what subtitle it is in. So for instance, section 401 falls under subtitle A, which is income taxes, and chapter 1 of that, which is called normal taxes and surtaxes, and then it's deferred compensation and so forth, and then you'd realize that it's something to do with pensions and profit sharing and stock bonus plans, etc. Okay, so that's how you got to read the statute. You can't just read the line. You have to know the context. And again, title controls subject. Okay, so and then subtitle C is employment. This is where most people get their definition from for their employment taxes. And this one has to do with Federal Insurance Contributions Act, and it falls under Section 3121. So this is FICA, and if you're a FICA employee, you fall under the 3121 group. However, if you don't pay FICA, like very few people actually don't, but let's say somehow you're excluded from that, and you're an employee under 3401, then take note that it's still pretty much in the same subtitle, which is employment taxes, but it's the collection of income at the source on wages. So it's slightly different. And then finally, this is in procedure and administration. The definition found at 7701 is actually in reference to this definition, 3121. And we're going to discuss 401, 3121, and 3401 as definitions of what an employee is. We'll start with a short recall of the terms from previous presentations. With the word include and including. Remember, in law, the word include and including excludes those things not within the meaning of the term defined. Also, the United States, as defined in the IRS code, I should say the Internal Revenue Code. The IRS doesn't have a code. The District of Columbia is equal to the United States, and it excludes the 50 union states. And the word state is also equal to the District of Columbia and excludes the 50 union states, except for some of the places where they include Puerto Rico, Guam, American Samoa, and Virgin Islands. But those you have to look kind of one at a time, and it doesn't apply to the 50 states anyway. And the word domestic means created or organized in the United States, which means in the District of Columbia, and again excludes the 50 states. So let's look at 3401 employees. An employee, for the purposes of this chapter, which is a collection of income at source on wages, the term employee includes an officer, an employee, or an elected official of the United States, a state, or any political subdivision thereof, or the District of Columbia, or any agency or instrumentality of any one or more of the foregoing. See? It says nothing about the average guy working in private sector. Then it also follows with the term employee also includes an officer of a corporation. Well, you think, well, let's see, I own a small company, let's say, then I must be attached to this. But think about what I said before. Remember title, control, subject? Well, when we say corporation, it's actually the United States Corporation. And to prove that, we're going to refer you to the Public Salary Act of 1939. All right, and here it is, Public Salary Act. It defines what a corporate agency is. And a corporate agency or instrumentality is one where a majority of the stock of which is owned by or on behalf of the United States, or the power to appoint or select a majority of the board of advisors of which is exercisable by or on behalf of the United States. So again, corporation means the United States Corporation. It doesn't mean your average, Joe's Pizza down the road on Main Street. Okay. Section 3121, employee. Remember, this one is from the FICA chapter. It says, 1, you're an officer of a corporation, okay? You are an individual who has the so-called usual common law rules in determining the employer-employee relationship, having the status of an employee. Now, think about this. They just define the word employee using the word employee. So that's what we call a tautology in logic. And that's why I have taken the liberty to insert what they mean for clarification purposes, because again, I'm going to take, this is part D, so I'm going to go down a couple lines to part H. I'm going to insert what they have defined as a domestic or American employer. So then that definition becomes an individual who has an employer-employee relationship where the employer is a domestic or American employer. In which case, you'll see that the American employer means the United States or any instrumentality thereof, an individual who is a resident of the United States, and a couple other things, but all those other things are United States persons, okay, like corporations organized under the laws of the United States, the District of Columbia, right, excluding the 50 states. And then part 3 definition is anyone who performs a service, okay. And then the word service we'll discuss later, but anyone who performs a service is by definition a government employee. Also, the last section is anyone who performs services that are included under an agreement pursuant to Section 218 of the Social Security Act, and that we will study in a bit. So a 3121 employee are, again, for summary purposes, an officer of the United States Corporation, or an individual who works for a domestic or United States employer, an individual who performs federal services, or a public employee occupying a covered position whose union, state, territory, political subdivision, or instrumentality volunteered on his or her behalf with the Social Security Administration. These people are subject. Number 4 refers to the Social Security Section 218. Okay, so if you're a public employee and your state has a volunteered contract with the Social Security Administration, you're subject to 3121. Okay. All right, next topic we want to learn about is trade or business. If you type in trade or business into the Google search engine, you'll immediately go to this page, which is the IRS definition of a trade or business. I'll let you read that, and put the video on pause for a second while you read it, and then try to form an impression of what you think it means. And then when we come back, hopefully you've unpaused the video, I'll tell you what the real definition means. The real definition means the term trade or business includes the performance of the functions of a public office. Did you know that? So if you're engaged in a trade or business, you're serving the government by definition. That's how it works. But if you read the IRS code, it gives you a bunch of mumble jumble about activities carried on for production of income and performing services and integrated assets and goodwill and business, or all this other needless nonsense. Because I don't know about you, but I was kind of deceived. Is there an intent to defraud? I'll let you be the judge of that. So, but one thing we can agree with the IRS from having studied their paperwork is that a trade or business are activities um, producing gross income. And we studied in previous presentation that gross income is federal income. Remember that? So gross income is federal income, and a trade or business is one that includes the public functions of a public office, which is just further evidence that gross income is federal income, and federal income is derived from a trade or business. Okay, now let's move on to Section 401 employee. Definitions and rules. This is regarding self-employed individuals and owner employees. Okay, so a self-employed individual is treated as an employee in this section, and the term employee includes an individual who is a self-employed individual. The term self-employed individual means an individual who has income or has earned income. The term earned income means the net earnings from self-employment, as defined in Section 1402A. Now, does that sound like a bunch of hogwash? It certainly does to me. I don't know how to read it except very carefully. And I know they're trying to pull a fast one here. But let me give you the bottom line up front. A Section 401 employee is one performing the functions of a public office. That it's one engaged in a statutory trade or business. Okay? And you can go through the nitty-gritty to derive that point, but let me summarize it for you. Self-employed individual means an individual who has net earnings from self-employment, and the term net earnings from self-employment means the gross income derived by an individual from a trade or business. Okay, remember, gross income is federal income, trade or business is federal work. So if you're a 401 self-employed individual, hey, you're working for the government. A 401 self-employed individual, okay, we just went over that. Okay, let's talk about service. What is service? Well, how about there's things like public service, social services, civil service, postal service, military service, and what do they all fall under the category of? Government service, right? So the word service means government service, and here's where it says it in the code. So service means to serve another, being employed to serve another. And to whom is service rendered? Well, if you look at the code, it's rendered at 3121 or 3401, or it's rendered to a service recipient. I mean, who else receives a service other than an employer or a service recipient? So what exactly is an employer at 3401? Well, we already kind of discussed it, but an employer means someone who works or someone who hires an employee. Okay, so it says here, an employer means a person for whom an individual performs or performed any service as the employee of such person. That's under 3401. A 3121 employer or an American employer means the United States or any instrumentality thereof. And 2, 3, 4, and 5 are all United States persons, that is, corporations that are based in the United States. Now, why is that point relevant, and how do you connect with the rest of our presentation? That's because, remember the intent of the 16th Amendment? It gave the power to tax corporations and take an excise on the privilege of doing business as an artificial entity. That's why if you are working for a United States person and you're an officer of that corporation, you're subject to the tax. And you're subject under 3121 as working for an American employer. Okay, so there are other places where the word employer is defined, such as 3306, which is under the Unemployment Tax Act. And an employer in that section means anyone who's paid wages, right? There are, again, other employers, and this is a point where if you actually work for a government, where if it's not even the federal government, but if you work for local government even, you have to be careful, because if you're working for a government unit, a subdivision, an instrumentality, a public authority, or even some banks, insurance companies, railroads, some public schools, libraries and public works, conservation and transportation projects, you might fall under the government instrumentalities employer or employee relationship. So this is where you would write them a note, to ask whether or not you fall. Their company is an instrumentality of the government. But for most people working for the private sector, it does not apply. Again, this is a potential trip up for those who work for banks, insurance companies, railroads, schools, libraries, public works, conservation, transportation, and local government. Okay, so let's talk about a service recipient, 6041A. This regards like 1099s issued for service and direct sales, usually 1099 miscellaneous. These are returns regarding remuneration of services for any service recipient engaged in a trade or business paying $600 or more. Okay, and now the service recipient means the person whom the service is performed. And go further down in the section, you'll read in section D that the person includes a governmental unit and any agency or instrumentality thereof. So if you received money from a service recipient, what they're claiming is that they are a government unit, agency, or instrumentality thereof. If you don't challenge that presumption, then guess what? You're subject to the tax. Okay, so there you go. Wages, as we've defined, is what an employee pays his employer for services. Okay, and or it's paid for employment. Okay. Now here's comes a crazy word, person. Person is the craziest word because we hear it all the time and nobody really has a clue what it means. And there's like 2.5 pages on the word person in type 6 font in Black's Law Dictionary. So you gotta kind of know this one. It's taken me a long time and I'm still studying, but the word person is a very tricky word in law. And it is tricky along with other very tricky words such as resident, citizen. People is not so tricky, but you need to know who they are. You're probably one of them. I am one of them. Jurisdiction is another crazy word that'll take you a while to study maybe. And the word court are all very, very important words that you ought to know. So the word person comes from the word persona, which is Greek, and it means mask. It's that mask that the Greeks used to wear in their amphitheaters while they did their plays. That's why characters have persona. See, like in a movie, characters have persona. In a book, a character has persona. So a person is best thought of as mask. Because they are performing an act, they have both rights and duties. In other words, they both exist and they have a purpose. They may be natural or artificial persons. Like a corporation is an artificial person. You and I are natural persons. They may be a group or an individual. They may be They may be the subject of custom definition, and that's where they get crazy complicated because they can mean absolutely anything. Therefore, treat persons carefully. With respect to the Internal Revenue Code, there's a number of persons that are described there. The first and most general person is an artificial person called an individual, a trust, an estate, partnership, association, a company, or corporation. That is kind of the more legal, generic definition of the word person. But remember, all these persons are persons that are U.S. persons, and there are persons who are taxpayer persons. Okay, and a taxpayer is one with a liability to pay tax, wherever that liability comes from. Now, the other types of person I want to briefly touch upon is the one that we've already went through, which is the 6041A person, which is the service recipient, which includes any government unit and any instrumentality thereof. There's also a 6045 person, who is basically a broker or a broker exchange, which also includes a governmental unit, agency, or instrumentality thereof. By the way, which means what? Which means if you get a form from your broker saying that you made certain income on stocks, what they're claiming is they're a government unit, an agency, or instrumentality thereof. And if the stocks that you bought are private stocks and they are outside of the federal jurisdiction, you really shouldn't be paying any interest on them. Taxes, federal income tax on them, because you've taken the risk to invest your money, okay? And the federal government didn't take that risk for you. So they have no interest in that money. Only you have interest in that money. So if you get some paper from the broker, make sure that you know what they're talking about, and make sure that the stocks that you're invested in are private stocks, as opposed to instrumentalities of government, which potentially you might have a tax associated with. Again, you would have to study the nitty-gritty on that one. But let's talk about penalties. There's a number of statutes. Here's 3 of them under the IRC, which talk about penalties, seizures, forfeitures, and assessable penalties, and miscellaneous penalties. Now, the IRC can only penalize persons, correct? So, if you see a court docket, it says, "Oh, you're this person," but look at how the persons are defined. It includes an officer or employee of a corporation, a member or employee of a partnership, who as such officer, employee, or member is under a duty to perform the act in respect of which the violation occurs. So first of all, are you an officer or an employee of a U.S. corporation? I guess you could be. How about, did you have a duty to perform that act? Remember how persons needed duty and also rights? Okay, so you need the right and the duty. So you got to be able to challenge whether or not you're even that person as defined under the statute, as far as these penalties, seizures, forfeitures, and assessable penalties are concerned. So be careful with the word person. That's all I have to say. Here's a W4 person. A W4 person is an employee who works for an employer. That makes you a government person. Okay? A W9 person is a U.S. person. Okay, a U.S. person, again, is one who resides or is a citizen of the District of Columbia, excluding the 50 states. Furthermore, here's another person, and this person is kind of important because he might be giving you some gifts. If you're going to get a gift from a person, I would highly recommend that they do not fill out this form unless they are actually giving you something from the United States, that is the federal government. Now look where it says, the instructions say number 7, right? Under citizenship. Well, guess what? You have to put down your citizenship. What do most people write down when they write down their citizenship? Well, they say, well, I'm American, therefore I must be a U.S. citizen. Well, if you put U.S. citizen in there, then the personal jurisdiction attaches to the subject of the gift. Okay, so the personal and subject matter jurisdiction becomes combined, and you're subject to paying the tax on that gift, even though it may not have anything to do with the United States. Okay, and look who must file. It says if you're a citizen or a resident of the United States, you must file a gift tax return. Well, do you actually live in Washington, D.C.? Are you a resident of the District of Columbia? Do you owe allegiance for protection from the District of Columbia? I mean, those are questions that would the answers of which would indicate whether or not you're a United States person. Okay, which brings us to the second or the next point, which is United States citizenship. United States citizenship is prima facie personal jurisdiction. It's not, but it does not give subject matter jurisdiction. Just because you're a United States person doesn't mean you must have earned federal income. Okay. Um, However, if you are a U.S. person giving a gift, or if you're a dead U.S. person whose estate is being divided, then again that personal jurisdiction attaches to the subject matter, and that gift is subject to the tax. Okay, and it says here, unless the defendant can prove he is not a citizen of the United States, the IRS has a right to inquire and determine a tax liability. Let me tell you, that can't be done, because what the court is saying is you have to prove a negative. You have to prove that you're not a citizen of the United States. That can't be done because proving a negative is nearly impossible. So what you have to do is you have to cast the burden of proof back to them and have them prove that you are not a Union State citizen. Okay? Next, a United States citizen is first defined in the 14th Amendment, and it's all persons born or naturalized in the United States, right? That's a District of Columbia, and subject to the jurisdiction thereof. The primary intent of the 14th Amendment, as most of you might know from studying, it was to confer citizenship to freed blacks after the Civil War. Now, today we're so far divorced from that era that I don't care if you're black, white, purple. I don't think it applies to you. And I don't think an honest court can say that, oh, you're black, therefore it applies to you. No, it doesn't. I don't think it does. Okay? And moreover, the Supreme Court of Utah in Diet versus Turner said it was not ratified. I mean, they made a long dissertation basically saying that the 14th Amendment was never ratified. And there's plenty of proof out there saying it isn't. And even if it was ratified, I want you to know that U.S. citizenship is a choice. You can be a citizen of a Union state, and let me tell you where I can find that. So on July 27th, 1868, the Expatriation Act was passed, in which you can basically expatriate to any foreign country, and by that means you can go to any Union state as well. Now, one day later, the 14th Amendment was allegedly passed. I don't see that as an accident, guys. I think the Expatriation Act of 1868 is the remedy. And if you read it carefully, you'll look for parts of it where it says the United States should guarantee protection to those persons that are in foreign places. They don't mean foreign places like overseas. They mean foreign places close enough for them to actually exert power. And so to me that means the states. Okay? Furthermore, the Supreme Court says, hey, you know what? If you're a United States citizen and you don't want to be one, that's fine. You can be a citizen of another state. So read here. A citizen of the United States can, of his own volition, become a citizen of any state of the Union by bona fide residence therein, with the same rights as the other citizens of that state. The slaughterhouse cases. Just so that we understand what citizenship means, it means allegiance. Citizenship is allegiance. Allegiance is for protection. Protection is for your obedience. And for that, just go to United States versus Wong Kim Ark. There's a big long write-up on that. Lastly, last but not least, remember you have a right to be tried by a jury of your peers, right? So look at the Sixth Amendment, right? Because I keep telling you guys, you got to look at your Constitution. It's like a manual of arms. It's there to protect you. And all So, in all criminal prosecutions, the accused shall enjoy a right to a speedy and public trial by an impartial jury of the state and district wherein the crime shall have been committed. Now, since all juries are selected from a pool of U.S. citizens, you have a theoretical basis for challenge because, hey, they're not citizens of your state. They all say they're U.S. citizens. I got nothing to do with them. They're not my peers. You see what I mean? You're one of the people. You have a right to be judged by other people, not 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 citizens. Citizens are subjects. Remember that, and people are the source of government power and the reservoir of sovereignty. Go look that up in the law dictionary. And by the way, again, you have a right to a trial by peers. What is a peer, guys? A peer is a member of the peerage. The peerage is the member of the nobility in Old England. So go look that up. If you're in a jury, you're a peer, which means you're a noble. If you're going to trial, guess what? You are among your peers. You're assumed to be a nobleman unless you act otherwise and you become a lesser person. Okay? So, what is your nationality? Well, according to the U.S. government printing office, your nationality is one of the demonyms listed for your state. For instance, Alabama would be an Alabamian, an Alaskan, a Arizonan. If you're from Utah, you would be a Utah, I guess. A Texan, a Massachusetts, an Oklahoman, a Pennsylvania, and so forth. So that is why in part one of this presentation, Honest Rella was a Californian. Remember, Honest Jane was a Pennsylvanian. Honest Abe was a Virginian, and Honest Tom was a Massachusetts. You see what I'm saying? How you define yourself makes a big difference. So there's a beginning and an end. When you write something to the IRS, you always want to start with I, a Missourian, an Alabamian, a Californian, etc. Or you can say I, one of the people of Missouri, Alabama, or California. And then you want to say residing in the county of Pulaski or Orange or Macon, etc. Now, the reason you do that is because, remember the 14th Amendment? It says you're a citizen of the United States and of the state in which you reside. Well, you want to fill in the residence not as your state, but as your county, because then your state becomes your citizenship, right? And the burden is shifted for them to disprove your citizenship. Otherwise, they're going to assume you're a U.S. person, which means their property. How do you let them know that you are not in the United States? Well, at the end of your correspondence and when you sign your tax returns, you always want to sign 26 USC 1746 1 without the United States. Now that is in the administrative code of the Title 28, which is an unsworn declaration under penalty of perjury, and you're signing it outside of the United States. In other words, you're not their property. Also, when you send them mail, uh, send it to their address with a zip code. But when you write your own address, do not write a zip code referring to your own address, because zip codes are, remember, they're created by the United States Postal Service. So guess what? Title controls subject, right? So they're telling you that you're a part of the United States Postal Service, and they're a part of the places defined at Article 1, Section 8, Clause 17. So is your home a place as defined in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 17? Well, it is if it's got a zip code on it, because you've given them a prima facie jurisdiction, or territorial jurisdiction, by putting it on your zip code. So their addresses have zip codes. Your addresses do not have zip codes, nor does your common law employer's address. Okay, so now that y'all know all this, let me just remind you that friends don't use deception. So if the IRS is trying to deceive you, as we've seen that they've been, they're not your friends, right? So what do you do if they're not your friends? You give them your name, rank, and serial number and nothing else. But here's a small catch. If you're able to give them a rank and a serial number, what does that mean? That means you work for them. And so you're subject to giving them basically everything else. But if you don't have a rank and serial number to give to them, then you have no liability. And if no one's given you a liability, then you have no liability. If you have no liability, you have no obligation. Therefore, you can take the Fifth Amendment and just walk away. Okay? So let's ask and answer the previously asked questions. Do you earn wages? How do you answer that? I answer it like I receive compensation for work, or I receive consideration for contract. Are you an employee? If I'm nice, I'll say I work for company XYZ. If I'm not nice, I'll say which office am I alleged to hold according to your Office of Personnel Management? See what I mean? Are you a U.S. person? We say I'm American and one of the people of Utah or Oklahoma or whatever state you're from. Do you have earned income? And how much earned income did you have? Well, let's be honest. I don't have any earned income. 0. And how much is it? I wish to remain private in my affairs. I mean, you can only say that if you actually don't have 0 income, okay? Do you own a trade or business? I work for private interests. That's your answer. I work for private interests. If you want to be a dick, say, what contract do you allege in my performance of the functions of a public office? See? Are you a self-employed individual? No, I'm not self-employed. I wish to remain private in my affairs. Or, as above, what contract do you allege in my performance of the functions of a public office? Okay, to see practical examples of how these concepts are applied on IRS forms, please watch Part 1. Thank you again. Please share, like, and comment. You have a duty to be honest, to obey and uphold the law, and to keep your brother from harm and injustice. So share this video with all the other Americans you know, and if they try to hurt you, you owe it to yourself to fight back. Thank you. End of Part 6 of 6.